Now, you know, France is sort of coming to terms with, in some ways, kind of a similar problem. That is, you know, the rule of the oligarchs via neoliberalism. And they're having a real struggle with this around the whole yellow vest movement. On the line with us is Cole Stangler, the Paris-based journalist and contributor to The Nation and Jacobin, among others. ColeStangler.com is his website. You can tweet him at Cole Stangler, S-T-A-N-G-L-E-R. Cole, welcome back to the program.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So I understand that on Monday, President Macron of France wrote a 2,300-word letter that was published in all the French newspapers. Marine Le Pen went out and gave a rant, basically. What's going on over there? You know, everybody's trying to say the yellow vest people are on my side, and it's not making all that much sense to me. What's happening?
So since the movement broke out in November, so this movement really peaked in November, over 200,000 people coming out. Protests have been ongoing now. We're about to have our 10th straight weekend of protests coming up on Saturday. And basically, in response to this movement, the government has given a handful of different concessions. So notably, they canceled the fuel tax hike, was the big demand of protesters that were enraged by this fuel tax as kind of the trigger from the movement. They've canceled that. In addition to that, the government made a number of other concessions, including extending a wage subsidy for low-income workers. And one of the other pieces, one of the other big pieces of the concessions package was the launching of the so-called Great National Debate. That's what you referred to, Macron launching that on Monday. And this debate is basically the government's attempt to really try to kind of channel the popular frustrations, the rage, and really try to institutionalize it and kind of come up with some kind of solution there. Now, the problem with this national debate is that the government promises it's going to touch on all kinds of topics. The problem is there isn't really any accountability mechanism here. So the government has said that they're going to have discussions with mayors. You can contribute online on a number of different themes. And at the end of the day, what's unclear is really what this is going to turn into. So this is going to go on for the next couple of months, but the end result is really unclear. And I should say as well, as part of this debate, there's 4 key themes here the government wants to focus on: the ecological transition, public spending and taxes, what they call public services, and then the final question, which is I think the most controversial, if maybe get into that, is what they call democracy and citizenship. And Macron, in that letter, kicking off this debate again on Monday, when he talked about democracy and citizenship, he floated the question of immigration, which, if you've been following the Yellow Vest movement, has very little to do with immigration. This is about people's economic suffering. This is about tax injustice, and this is about, as you put it, rebellion really against the kind of neoliberal vision that Emmanuel Macron represents.
So how are the French people responding to Macron? And I mean, if you look back over history, I mean, literally, like back to the 1870s in the United States, what you find is that every time there was a massive effort at deregulation, as happened in the 1870s through the 1890s here, it led right to the, you know, for example, the great crash of 1893, which then led right to a really, you know, to the antitrust movement and to the labor unions, labor movement that really lasted until World War I, I'd say, and then kind of rebooted itself after the great crash in 1929 again. Is there a populist uprising happening, and is Macron ignoring it, not getting it, trying to talk past it, or trying to co-opt it?
No, there's no question there's a populist uprising here. You know, when Macron first became president, there were a lot of parallels being made to Margaret Thatcher in the UK. And when Macron had his very unpopular labor reforms that actually went through, so first, labor law reform, basically making it easier for bosses to lay off workers. Secondly, going after road worker unions in particular, those 2 reforms really crushed the labor movement. And you started to have people drawing these parallels to Margaret Thatcher, you know.
And I think Ronald Reagan.
In France, and Reagan as well, obviously, with the PAC House strike in the early 80s. What we've seen right now in France is that the resistance is strong enough, and that Macron is not going to be able to get his policies through. I mean, as unpopular as they are today, when you look back at the real legacy of Reagan and Thatcher in the U.S. and the U.K., when they were governing, they did have a non-negligible amount of public support, a real base. The difference with France is that Macron doesn't really have that base. If you look at his approval ratings right now, they're under 30%. I know we talk a lot about Trump being unpopular. I mean, Macron is under 30% approval rating. So it's an incredibly unpopular presidency. His party's very unpopular, and And what we've seen, with the Yellow Vest movement is them really reluctantly making these concessions. And now this attempt at this great national debate, which already is polling very low. What I think is remarkable about the Yellow Vest movement is, in spite of now coming up on the 10th week of protest, you still have broad public support. And to be clear as well, it's not entirely obvious what people are continuing to protest. When they're coming out in the streets, we had 50,000 coming out last Saturday. It was an increase over the holidays. Then 50,000 2 weekends ago, and then 84,000 last Saturday. So the movement is back on the rise. It's unclear exactly what people are even protesting, but there is support for this desire to continue going out on the street and showing your opposition to the government. One of the most infamous slogans here is calling on Macron to resign.
Is this revolt against neoliberalism? I think we're seeing the same thing here in the United States. In fact, particularly we're seeing it writ large in the Democratic Party with the rise of progressives and the pushing back, the confrontation of, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez defeating Joe Crowley. He was the consummate neoliberal. She's the consummate progressive democratic socialist. And there's a visible rebellion against neoliberalism here in the United States. You're positing that the Yellow Vest movement is a rebellion against that in France. What about the rest of Europe and the rest of the world, for that matter? What are you seeing?
Well, I think before that, just to hone in again on France for a second, which is interesting. You talked about what's going on in the Democratic Party in the U.S. And right now we're seeing that revolt really taking the form of this kind of left flank of the Democratic Party being emboldened. Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, and others in Congress. Bernie Sanders, obviously, as well, as an independent. The thing about France is, in some ways, there's a stronger kind of opposition to Macron and against this kind of world vision. On the other hand, the political expression of that is much more unclear, which is to say there's not a political party that clearly embodies the Yellow Vest movement. There's a kind of mix of some of the protesters are kind of more drawn to right-wing kind of sovereigntist ideas about protecting the French nation against the EU. You have others that are more clearly from a left-wing kind of direction. And if you look at polls right now, people are supporting the left and the right that are actually consider themselves to be Yellow Vest. So I think we should be all cognizant of the fact and really applauding the fact that this is a clearly a movement of opposition against Emmanuel Macron. I think that's good. But at the same time, there are some dangers here. We don't really know where this is going. And as you alluded to, Marine Le Pen of the far-right National Front really trying to capitalize on this wave as well. We have the European elections coming up in May, in a few months from now. Steve Bannon, very famously, is trying to get involved here in Europe and try to bring his polling operation and data analytics to a number of different parties. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. And what's unfortunate as well, looking ahead to these EU elections in May, is that the far-right populists are doing pretty well in the polls, whether that's in France, where they're running about neck and neck with Emmanuel Macron's party, or we look elsewhere in countries like Germany, which didn't really have this kind of expression of far-right populism until pretty recently. So there is something in the air, but it's not all positive.
Yeah,
it's not all progressive.
Oh, and in some cases it's been institutionalized. I mean, look at Viktor Orban's Hungary, or look at Poland. It's or Turkey. And of course the right-wing parties are trying to grab everything they can from this. Cole Stangler was our guest. He's a Paris-based journalist and contributor to The Nation and Jacobin. ColeStangler.com is the website. His Twitter handle is Cole Stangler, Stangler. Cole, thanks for dropping by.